A millionaire finds an unconscious man in front of his mansion. An old key reveals secrets of a forgotten past. An unexpected reunion brings to light an unthinkable betrayal. The man seeking help has been hiding a mystery for years. The Harrington mansion stood imposingly atop the hill, like a solitary fortress against the outside world. The last rays of the March sun painted its white walls with gold as Victor Harrington gazed at the city of Chicago through the large windows of his library. At 55, he had grown accustomed to the solitude he had chosen for himself, turning it into a silent companion. The office, filled with ancient books and dusty photographs, was his refuge. There, among memories carefully stored, in locked drawers, he managed to keep his distance from the past he had worked so hard to forget. The mansion's thick walls muffled the sounds of the city, creating an environment where time seemed to flow more slowly. "Mr. Victor!" The distressed voice of Margaret, his housekeeper of over 2 decades, broke the usual silence. "There's a man collapsed at the gate." Victor stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup onto important documents. In other times, this would have deeply irritated him, but something in Margaret's urgency alarmed him. He hurried down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. "I've already called Joseph to help," Margaret said, following him to the main gate. "He's breathing, but he's unresponsive." The unconscious body lay on the stone pavement. Victor approached cautiously, years of isolation having made him wary. The man appeared to be around his age, dressed in simple but well-kept clothes, and his face. Victor felt his blood run cold. Even with the years etched into the stranger's face, he would recognize him anywhere. "Andrew," he murmured, a name. He hadn't spoken in decades. "Do you know him?" Margaret asked, surprised. "I did," he replied curtly. "A long time ago." With the help of Joseph, the driver, they carried Andrew into the mansion. Victor ignored Margaret's protests about bringing a stranger into the house and ordered them to prepare the guest room. As they climbed the stairs, memories he had locked away began to surface. Andrew Mendelsohn had been his best friend in their youth. Together they were inseparable, sharing dreams and confidences. The Harrington family business, at the time one of the largest construction companies in the country, was destined to be managed by both of them. Victor as the rightful heir, and Andrew as the brilliant administrator he had become. But everything changed that spring of 1990. In the guest room, Victor watched the unconscious face of his old friend as Margaret applied cold compresses to his forehead. What had happened to Andrew all these years? Why show up now, just when Victor had managed to build a life of peace and order? "I'll call a doctor," Margaret decided, but Victor stopped her. "Not yet. Let's wait for him to wake up." The housekeeper looked at him with concern. In 20 years of service, he had never seen his boss so disturbed. "Are you sure, sir? He might be ill." "I am," he replied firmly. "Please, leave us alone." When the door closed, Victor allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He approached the window, gazing at the garden where he had so often spoken with Andrew about the future. The past began to unravel like a ball of yarn, bringing to the surface memories he preferred to keep buried. A low groan brought him back to the present. Andrew began to stir, his eyelids fluttering slightly. Victor remained still, his heart racing. After a few moments, Andrew's eyes opened, disoriented at first until they focused on Victor. The recognition was immediate. Andrew tried to sit up, but Victor stopped him with a gesture. "Don't strain yourself. You fainted at the gate." "Victor," Andrew's voice came out hoarse, laden with emotion. "After all this time, why are you here?" The question came out harsher than Victor intended, but years of resentment couldn't be erased easily. Andrew averted his gaze, his hands nervously clutching the sheet. "It wasn't by choice," he replied vaguely. "I needed to find you." Victor felt his suspicion grow. After 30 years, what's changed now? Before Andrew could answer, something fell from his pocket. An old bronze key with a peculiar design on the handle. Victor recognized it instantly, and his world stopped spinning. It was identical to the key to the main vault of the old Harrington construction company, the one that had disappeared along with crucial documents during the scandal. The silence that followed was as thick as fog. Victor picked up the key from the floor, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched the cold metal. Andrew tried to get up again, this time managing to sit on the bed. "You kept this all this time?" Victor's voice was controlled, but his eyes revealed a storm of emotions. "It's not what you're thinking," Andrew replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "This case, it could be our salvation." Victor laughed bitterly. "Salvation? You destroyed everything my family built, Andrew. The construction company. Our friendship, Helen." His voice faltered as he uttered that name. Andrew's face paled even more. "Helen. She's also involved in all of this, more than we ever imagined." The mention of that name brought back memories Victor had fought hard to keep buried. Helen Damascene, the woman they both loved, who vanished around the same time the Harrington construction company collapsed amid accusations of corruption and embezzlement. "Don't you dare speak of her," Victor warned, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "You don't have that right." "I do," Andrew insisted, his voice gaining strength. "Because she might be alive, Victor." The words hit Victor like a punch. He staggered to the armchair near the window, collapsing heavily into it. "Impossible. She disappeared 30 years ago. And all this time you never wondered why? Never questioned the circumstances?" Victor closed his eyes, remembering the day Helen simply didn't show up for work. Her apartment was empty, her bank accounts wiped clean. No note, no explanation. The police investigated for months, but she had vanished like smoke. "Of course I questioned it," he replied bitterly, "but you also disappeared around the same time, taking vital company documents with you. The scandal broke days later. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together." Andrew struggled to his feet, leaning on the headboard of the bed. "The pieces you put together form an incomplete puzzle, my friend. There's much more to this story." At that moment, Margaret knocked on the door carrying a tray with tea and cookies. Victor took advantage of the interruption to regain his composure, slipping the key into his jacket pocket. "Are you feeling better?" Margaret asked Andrew, her voice a mix of concern and suspicion. "Yes, thank you very much," he replied politely. "You're very kind." After Margaret left, Andrew picked up the teacup with trembling hands. "Your housekeeper seems very dedicated." "Don't change the subject," Victor cut in. "You mentioned Helen. What do you know about her?" Andrew took a sip of tea before answering. "I received a letter 3 months ago. No sender, just an envelope with an old photograph and a few words written on the back." "What words?" "The truth is kept where it all began. H." Andrew pulled a crumpled envelope from his shirt pocket. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Victor took the envelope carefully, as if handling a sacred relic. His heart raced as he recognized Helen's elegant, slanted handwriting. The photograph showed the three of them together, smiling, in front of the first project of the Harrington Construction Company. "This could be a trap," Victor pondered, though his eyes couldn't tear away from the image. "Someone might be using the past against us." "That's what I thought at first," Andrew agreed. "But then I started receiving anonymous phone calls. A woman's voice, Victor. A voice I would recognize anywhere." Victor stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The sun had already set, and the city lights began to dot the darkness. "Why now, after so long?" "I don't know," Andrew admitted. "But there's something bigger at play. Powerful people are involved, the same ones who tore us apart in the past." "What people?" Andrew hesitated. "I can't reveal everything yet, but I need your help, Victor. We need to find out what really happened back then." Victor turned to face him. "How can I trust you after everything?" "I'm not asking you to trust me," Andrew replied softly. "I'm asking you to trust the memory of who we once were. The friendship we shared, and most of all the love we both felt for Helen." Silence filled the room again, heavy with unspoken meanings. Victor looked again at the photograph in his hands, at the smiles frozen in time, at the promise of a future that never came to pass. "You have 1 week," he finally decided. 1 week to prove to me that you're not lying. After that, I want you out of my house." Andrew nodded, understanding that this was the only chance he would get. "It's more than I deserve." As he left the room, Victor didn't notice the determined gleam in his old friend's eyes. nor the small smile that formed on his lips. The game had only just begun, and the pieces were already in motion. The night dragged on slowly in the Harrington mansion. Victor remained in his library until the early hours, revisiting old folders and documents he hadn't touched in years. The contents of the private safe revealed fragments of a life he had tried to forget. Old photos of the construction company, newspaper clippings about project inaugurations, and letters. So many letters from Helen. "You should rest," Margaret commented, entering with a cup of coffee. Her worried eyes took in the unusual mess in the always impeccable office. "It's past 2 in the morning." Victor looked up from the papers scattered across the desk. "I can't sleep, Margaret. There's something that doesn't add up in this whole story." The housekeeper placed the cup on the table, carefully moving some documents aside. "Do you trust that man? After all this time, no?" The answer came quickly, but Victor soon softened his tone. "But I don't trust my own memories from that time either. Everything happened so fast." Margaret hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words. "There's something you need to know. When I helped Mr. Andrew settle into the guest room, I noticed he was carrying an old notebook. While I was putting his clothes in the closet, it fell, and some pages came loose." Victor immediately straightened in his chair. "And what did you see?" "Notes, lots of notes, and a name that kept repeating, Project Phoenix." Margaret furrowed her brow. "There were also numbers, dates, and Mrs. Helen's name appeared on several pages." Victor's heart raced. Project Phoenix, that name stirred something in his memory. An old conversation, almost forgotten. It was the last major project the construction company started before the scandal, an ambitious venture that never got off the ground. "Margaret, I need you to do something for me," Victor said, standing up. "Keep an eye on our guest discreetly. Any strange behavior, any suspicious phone calls, let me know immediately." The housekeeper nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "Do you think he's plotting something?" "I don't know," Victor replied honestly. "But I intend to find out." After Margaret left, Victor opened a locked drawer in his desk. At the bottom, hidden beneath old papers, was a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. In it, Helen was smiling in front of the model of Project Phoenix, her eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. Beside her, Andrew held architectural blueprints while Victor rested his hand on his shoulder. A perfect team until everything fell apart. A noise in the hallway alerted him, soft footsteps almost imperceptible. Victor quickly put the photograph away and approached the door. Through the crack, he saw Andrew sneaking toward the stairs, leading to the basement. Without making a sound, Victor followed him. The basement of the mansion held old construction company files, boxes and boxes of documents he had never had the courage to discard. What was Andrew looking for there? In the dim light, Victor watched his old friend rummaging through the boxes with a flashlight. His movements were precise, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. After a few minutes, Andrew picked up a yellowed folder and opened it. Even from a distance, Victor recognized the Project Phoenix logo. Looking for something specific? Victor turned on the basement light, startling Andrew. "Victor." Andrew didn't try to hide the folder. "I knew you'd follow me. So that's why you came to the basement in the middle of the night? To lure me down here?" Andrew smiled sadly. "I needed to be sure these documents still existed. Helen. She told me they'd be here." "Helen told you?" Victor stepped closer, his voice filled with disbelief. "When?" "The last time I saw her, a week before everything fell apart." Andrew handed the folder to Victor. "She knew something was about to happen. She tried to warn us, but we didn't." "Listen." Victor took the folder with trembling hands. Inside, along with the plans for the Phoenix project, was something he had never seen before, a series of handwritten notes by Helen detailing irregularities and threats the construction company had been facing. "Why did she never show me this?" "Because you were being watched," Andrew replied softly. "We all were. Helen uncovered something big, Victor, something involving powerful people, people who wouldn't hesitate to use any means to protect their interests." Victor flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each revelation. "This changes everything." "No," Andrew interrupted him. "This is just the beginning. The real secret. The one Helen protected with her disappearance is still out there. And now, after 30 years, she wants the truth to come out. A noise from upstairs caught both their attention. Heavy footsteps, unlike those of Mrs. Margaret. Victor and Andrew exchanged worried glances. I kept a digital copy of all. These documents, Andrew whispered quickly. Go check who's upstairs. We need to be cautious now. Victor cautiously climbed the basement stairs, his senses alert to any movement. The mansion, usually silent at that hour, seemed to breathe with a life of its own. When he reached the main hallway, he found Joseph, the driver, standing near the library door. Joseph, what are you doing awake at this hour? The driver turned, visibly nervous. Sorry, Mr. Victor, it's just, well, there's a car that's been parked in front of the mansion for hours. I thought it was strange and decided to do a round. Victor approached the window. Indeed, a black sedan was parked across the street, its tinted windows preventing anyone from seeing inside. How long has it been there? Since Mr. Andrew arrived, Joseph replied hesitantly, and it's not the first time I've seen it. This same car has been appearing in recent days, always from a distance, always watching. The information hit Victor like a warning. Could it be the same people Andrew had mentioned, those who supposedly had been watching them in the past? Go rest, Joseph, he ordered, keeping his voice calm despite his concern. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. When the driver left, Victor returned to the library. Andrew was already there, carefully storing the Phoenix Project folder among other documents. We have company, Victor informed him, closing the door. A suspicious car on the street. Andrew didn't seem surprised. They've always been around, Victor. It's just that now they're not bothering to hide anymore. Who are they? Enough with the half-truths, Andrew. I need to know exactly what I'm stepping into. Andrew sat heavily in one of the armchairs. Do you remember the National Construction Consortium? That group that tried to buy Harrington months before the scandal? Of course I do. They offered a fortune, but my father refused. He said there was something wrong with that proposal, something dirty. Your father was right, Andrew confirmed, his voice low and intense. The consortium was just the front for a much larger operation. Helen discovered they were using legitimate construction companies to launder money through overpriced projects. Victor felt his blood run cold. And Harrington would have been next. Exactly. When your father refused the offer, they decided to destroy the company another way. That's when they started pressuring me. Andrew ran a hand over his face, the weight of the memories evident in his gestures. They threatened my family, Victor. They said they'd make it look like I was involved in all the schemes if I didn't cooperate. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because they made it very clear that you'd be the next target if I opened my mouth. And Helen, she was investigating everything, gathering evidence, when they realized she was getting too close to the truth. A sharp sound cut through the conversation, the library phone ringing at that late hour. Victor and Andrew exchanged tense glances. On the screen, only the word unknown appeared. With a racing heart, Victor answered, putting it on speakerphone. Victor? A woman's voice, familiar even after 3 decades, made both men hold their breath. Don't trust everything they're telling you. There are more layers to this story than you realize. Helen? Victor could barely speak. Is it really you? I don't have much time, she continued, her voice urgent. Is Andrew there with you? I'm here, Andrew replied, stepping closer to the phone. Good. You need to find the flash drive I hid in the old office of the construction company. It's inside the last drawer, behind the false bottom, but be careful. You're not the only ones looking for it. Helen, wait. Victor tried to prolong the conversation. Why now? Why after all this time? There was a tense pause. Because now they're vulnerable. The truth can finally come out without anyone getting hurt. But you need to be quick. They've already realized you're together again. The call ended abruptly, leaving only the sound of the dial tone filling the library's silence. Victor and Andrew stared at each other, their minds processing what had just happened. The old office, Andrew murmured. Is it still standing? Yes, Victor replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. The building was sold, but the top floor, where our headquarters were, has been abandoned for years. No one wanted to occupy the space after the scandal. We need to go there. Victor looked out the window. The black sedan was still parked across the street, a shadowy presence in the night. "It won't be easy. We're being watched." "There's always a way," Andrew smiled, a glimmer of the old strategist shining in his eyes. "Remember how we used to bypass the construction company's security when we wanted to work late?" For the first time since their reunion, Victor felt a genuine smile form on his lips. The maintenance tunnel, they connected all the buildings in the block. "And I bet they're still there," Andrew added. "Abandoned and forgotten, like so. Any other secrets in this story?" Dawn found Victor and Andrew in the basement of the mansion, studying old blueprints of the area. Mrs. Margaret watched them with concern as she served strong coffee and freshly baked cheese bread. "You two haven't slept at all," she remarked, setting the tray on an improvised table. "This can't be good for you." "We're fine, Margaret," Victor replied distractedly, his eyes fixed on the technical drawings spread out before him. "But I need you to do something important. Call all my appointments for today and cancel them. Say I'm unwell." The housekeeper frowned but nodded. Years of service had taught her when not to question her employer's decisions. Before leaving, however, she turned to Andrew. "You barely touched your breakfast. You need to eat to regain your strength." Andrew smiled gently. "You remind me of my mother, Mrs. Margaret, always taking care of everyone." When they were alone, again Victor pointed to a specific section of the blueprint. "Here, the tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the old wine cellar. If it still exists, it will take us straight to the shopping center, 2 blocks from the construction company's building." "And you're sure no one else knows about these tunnels?" "Only the old board members knew about them. They were our escape route in case of an emergency." Victor paused, remembering. "Helen used to joke that they were our secret paths for corporate adventures." Andrew smiled at the memory. "She always had a way of turning something serious into fun. Remember when she organized that surprise party for your father at the office? We used the tunnels to set everything up without him suspecting a thing." Victor's smile faded. "My father, he would be devastated if he knew everything that happened to the company he built." "That's why we need to uncover the truth," Andrew said with conviction. "Clear the Harrington family name." At that moment, Joseph hurriedly entered the basement. "Mr. Victor, the suspicious car finally left. But before that, I saw someone taking pictures of the mansion." Victor and Andrew exchanged worried glances. "They're keeping watch," Andrew murmured. "We need to act now, while we have an opening." "Joseph," Victor called the driver, "I need you to do me a favor. Take the car and drive to the mall in the south side. Stay there for a few hours. Make sure you're seen. We want them to think I'm following my usual Thursday routine." After Joseph left, Victor led Andrew to the old wine cellar. The place, though clean thanks to Mrs. Margaret's care, still carried an air of neglect. Dust-covered wine bottles lined the dark wooden shelves, silent witnesses to more prosperous times. "The entrance must be behind that shelf," Victor pointed out, carefully maneuvering between the bottles. "Help me push it." The heavy piece of furniture slid with difficulty, revealing a time-stained metal door. Victor turned the rusty handle, which gave way with a protesting creak. "It still works," he murmured, surprised. A dark corridor stretched. Out before them, the stagnant air heavy with decades of secrets. Victor turned on the flashlight they had prepared, revealing concrete walls covered with old pipes. "Are you sure it's safe?" Andrew asked, noticing some cracks in the ceiling. "These tunnels were built to last," Victor replied, stepping into the corridor. "My father personally oversaw every stage of the construction." As they walked through the tunnel, their footsteps leaving marks in the accumulated dust, memories of the past seemed to come alive in the shadows. Victor could almost hear the echoes of old conversations, shared laughter, dreams that once seemed so possible. "Victor," Andrew called softly, interrupting his thoughts. "There's something I need to tell you about Helen, something I recently discovered." Victor stopped, turning to face his friend. The flashlight's light cast dramatic shadows on their faces. "What?" "Remember that trip she took to Washington, D.C. a week before she disappeared? It wasn't just a business trip. She went to meet someone from the federal government." "How do you know that?" "Because I found the hotel records where she stayed, and more importantly, I found a photo." Andrew pulled an envelope from his pocket. A photo that shows Helen entering an official building, carrying a briefcase very similar to the one we found in the basement. Victor took the envelope with trembling hands. The photo, though old and slightly faded, clearly showed Helen climbing the stairs of a grand building. Her expression was serious, determined. She was gathering evidence, Andrew continued. Not just about the consortium scheme, but about something much bigger, something that involved people from the government itself. A distant noise interrupted the conversation, the sound of metal scraping against metal. Victor quickly turned off the flashlight, plunging them into complete darkness. "There's someone else here," he whispered, "someone who knows the tunnels." The silence in the tunnel was absolute, broken only by the controlled breathing of the two men. Victor and Andrew remained motionless, their senses heightened, trying to detect any movement in the darkness. The footsteps approached slowly, echoing off the concrete walls. A faint light began to appear around the curve of the tunnel, gradually growing brighter. "This way," Victor whispered, pulling Andrew into an old maintenance room he knew existed in that section. The small compartment, once used to store tools, now served as an improvised hiding place. Through the crack in the rusted door, they watched a figure emerge from the darkness. It was a woman, her grey hair pulled back into a severe bun. Even in the dim light, Victor recognized her immediately. "Rachel Meyer," he murmured, so softly that only Andrew could hear. "My father's former secretary." The woman stopped near the door where they were hiding, illuminating the walls with her flashlight as if searching for something. Rachel had worked at Harrington Construction for over 2 decades, practically part of the family. After the scandal, she simply disappeared, like so many others. "She always knew about the tunnels," Andrew commented in the same whispered tone. "She was one of the few people your father completely trusted." Rachel continued her methodical inspection until something in her pocket vibrated, a cell phone. She answered quickly. "Yes, I'm here." "No, still no sign of them, but I'm sure they'll come." Her voice, though aged, retained the same efficient tone as before. "The vault remains intact exactly where Helen said it would be." "Yes, I'll keep watching. Don't worry, they won't get there first." Victor and Andrew exchanged meaningful glances in the darkness. Rachel wasn't there by chance. She was looking for the same thing they were. After the footsteps of the former secretary faded away, the two men waited a few minutes before emerging from their hiding spot. "She mentioned Helen," Victor commented, his mind racing. "And a safe." "Which isn't the same one we're looking for," Andrew added. "Helen must have left more than one clue, more than one hiding place." "Rachel was always more than she seemed," Victor reflected, recalling details from the past. "In important meetings, she didn't just take notes. She observed, analyzed. My father used to say she had a sixth sense for business." "And now she's working for someone," Andrew continued. "Someone who's also interested in the secrets Helen kept." They continued moving through the tunnel, now with extra caution. Every shadow could hide another observer. Every sound could be a sign of danger. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a metal staircase leading to a hatch in the ceiling. Victor climbed up first, carefully pushing the hatch open. They were exactly where they planned to be, in the basement of the old shopping center. "The construction company's building is 2 blocks from here," Victor explained as he helped Andrew up. "We can use the mall's back exit and—" His voice was cut off by the sound of approaching footsteps. Quickly, they closed the tunnel hatch and hid behind some stacked boxes. A mall employee hurried past, carrying documents. When her footsteps faded, Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We need to be more careful," he warned. "Rachel might not be the only one watching us." Victor nodded, his mind returning to Helen's call the night before. She knew this would happen. She knew others would be looking for the flash drive. Helen always thought several steps ahead, Andrew remarked with a wistful smile. "Like in a game of chess." "And are we just pieces on that board?" Andrew grew serious. "No. We're players who lost an important game 30 years ago. Now we have a chance for a rematch." They left the basement discreetly, blending in with the employees arriving for the start of the workday. Through the storefront windows, Victor could see the top of the Harrington Construction building. Now just another commercial building, its elegant lines marred by time and neglect. "The office is on the top floor," he explained as they walked. "But there's one detail that complicates things. The elevator was deactivated years ago. We'll have to use the emergency stairs. 15 floors, Andrew calculated. Nothing we haven't done before." Victor smiled with irony. "We were 30 years younger back then." As they approached the building, a familiar figure crossed the street a few meters ahead. Rachel Meyer, walking with her always impeccable posture. She entered the building as if she still worked there. "She's heading straight for the vault she mentioned," Andrew deduced. "Then we have to be faster," Victor replied, his face showing a determination he hadn't felt in years. "Helen wouldn't leave false clues. If there are 2 vaults, 2 clues, it's because each holds a different part of the truth." A group of executives passed by them, creating the perfect distraction for them to enter the building without drawing attention. The lobby, once elegant and imposing, now showed clear signs of decay. "Ready to climb 15 floors?" Victor asked, heading toward the emergency stairwell door. Andrew adjusted his jacket, his face showing a mix of apprehension and determination, ready to find out what Helen wanted to show us all these years. The echo of Victor and Andrew's footsteps resonated through the empty stairwell, marking their slow ascent through the floors of the abandoned building. The air was heavy with decades of dust and memories, each landing bringing reminders of a time when the building pulsed with life and ambition. On the 8th floor, Andrew had to stop to catch his breath. "We need to exercise more," he commented, trying to keep his spirits up despite the fatigue. Victor, also out of breath, took the pause to check if Rachel had left any trace of her passage. The stairs showed recent marks in the dust, confirming that she had indeed gone up that way. "She has about a 15-minute lead," Victor calculated, but knowing Rachel, she's probably being methodical, checking every possible hiding spot. "How did she know about the tunnels?" Andrew asked, finally regaining his breathing rhythm. "And more importantly, who is she working for now?" "Rachel was always my father's eyes and ears," Victor replied, resuming the climb. "She knew every secret of the construction company, every important document, including the ones that disappeared." Andrew tensed. "Are you suggesting that she—" "I don't know," Victor interrupted, "but it's another piece of the puzzle Helen left us." They continued climbing, increasingly aware of the passing time. On the 12th floor, a metallic noise above them made them stop again. "There's someone else on the stairs," Andrew whispered. They stood still, listening for any sound. Footsteps were descending hurriedly, approaching their position. Victor pulled Andrew behind the fire door on the 12th floor, just in time to see a figure rush past, a man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. "It wasn't Rachel," Andrew remarked as the footsteps faded. "No," Victor agreed, his mind racing. "But he was coming from our floor." They resumed their climb with renewed urgency. When they reached the 15th floor, the door to the old construction company office was slightly ajar. Victor signaled for Andrew to stay quiet as they approached. The office, once a symbol of the Harrington family's business power, was now just an empty shell. Furniture covered in dusty sheets created ghostly shapes in the dimly lit space. The huge windows, once impeccably clean, were dulled by years of neglect. "Rachel!" Victor called, his voice echoing through the empty room. A noise from the old president's office caught their attention. They found Rachel Meyer sitting in her father's old chair, her eyes fixed on a photograph she held in her hands. "It took longer than I expected," she said without looking up. "I thought you'd arrive sooner." "You knew we'd come," Victor stated, not as a question. Rachel finally looked up, her eyes showing a mix of weariness and determination. "Helen told me you would. 30 years ago, she made me promise I'd be here on this day." Andrew stepped forward. "You stayed in touch with Helen all this time?" "Not directly," Rachel replied, placing the photograph on the desk. "She left instructions, specific dates, places I needed to be, like a game of coordinates through time." Victor approached the desk, recognizing the photograph. It was from the day the construction company's first project was inaugurated. His father, young and proud, was cutting the ribbon. Beside him, Rachel smiled subtly, always present, always watching. "Why did you disappear after the scandal?" Victor asked, his voice betraying old hurt. "You were practically family." "Exactly. Because of that," Rachel answered, her face softening. "Your family needed someone on the outside, someone who could help when the time was right. And has that time come?" Rachel nodded, opening a drawer in the desk. From it, she pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "Helen left this for you. She said it should only be opened when the two of you were together again in this room." Victor took the envelope with trembling hands. On the back, Helen's elegant handwriting had written, "For when the circle closes." "The man we saw coming down the stairs," Andrew recalled. "Was he looking for this?" "No," Rachel replied, a shadow of concern crossing her face. "He was looking for something else, something Helen hid elsewhere in this building, something she knew they would never stop searching for." "And what would that be?" Rachel stood up, adjusting her blazer with the same precise gesture from 30 years ago. "Open the envelope. Helen will explain it better than I can." As Rachel walked toward the door, Victor called out to her one last time, "Why now? Why did Helen choose this moment?" The former secretary stopped at the threshold, a small enigmatic smile on her lips. "Because now you are ready to face the truth. And because those who destroyed the Harrington Construction Company have finally let their guard down." After Rachel left, Victor and Andrew exchanged glances, the envelope weighing heavily between them like a silent testament to 3 decades of secrets. The envelope trembled slightly in Victor's hands as he carefully opened it, fearing he might damage its contents. Andrew stepped closer, his breath held in anticipation. From inside, Victor pulled out several sheets of paper, Helen's handwriting, as vivid as if it had been written that very day. "My dear Victor and Andrew," he began to read aloud, his voice choked with emotion. "If you are reading this letter, it means you have finally found your way back to each other, as I always knew you would." Andrew leaned on the old desk, his eyes fixed on the words emerging from the past. "What I am about to reveal will change everything you believe you know about what happened 30 years ago. But first, I need you to understand, every decision I made, every secret I kept, was to protect you and the legacy of the Harrington family." Victor paused, his hands trembling even more. Andrew gently took the pages, continuing to read. "When I discovered the true plans of the consortium, I realized we were dealing with something much bigger than a simple hostile takeover. They didn't just want the construction company. They wanted to use its reputation, its government contracts, its impeccable structure. Harrington would only be the first of many companies they planned to control." "The Phoenix Project," Victor murmured, the pieces starting to fall into place. Andrew continued reading. "The Phoenix Project wasn't just another venture. It was a facade for a complex operation involving high-ranking government figures. When your father refused the buyout offer, Victor, they decided to destroy the company from within, and for that they needed someone who knew all its operations." Victor looked at Andrew, who had turned pale. "They chose you." "Yes," Andrew replied, his voice low. "But Helen knew. She knew everything." Returning to the letter. "Andrew, I know you've carried the weight of guilt for 30 years, but I need you to understand you were also a victim. They used your family as leverage, just as they tried to use mine. The difference is that I managed to stay one step ahead." "What does she mean by that?" Victor asked. Andrew continued reading. "For months, I copied documents, recorded conversations, gathered evidence, not just about the consortium scheme, but about the entire network of corruption they had built. Rachel was my silent ally in this mission. Every important document, every crucial piece of evidence was carefully hidden in different places. That's why there are 2 safes," Victor realized. "She split the information to protect it. The flash drive they're looking for," the letter continued, "contains only half the story. The other half is stored in a place that only the 2 of you together can find. Think, what was our secret spot back in college? Where did we plan the future that seemed so bright?" Victor and Andrew exchanged glances, the memory hitting them simultaneously. "The lake house," they said in unison. "Your family's property in Lake Geneva," Andrew recalled. "We spent so many weekends there, planning the future of the construction company." "Keep reading." A familiar voice sounded from the door, startling. Both of them. Rachel had returned, her face showing an urgency that wasn't there before. The man we saw, he wasn't alone. Others are coming. Victor quickly returned to the letter. I know that by the time you're reading this, the same men who destroyed Harrington will be desperately searching for this evidence. But they're looking in the wrong places, following false leads I planted over the years. We need to go, Rachel insisted. They're coming up. Andrew quickly tucked the letter back into the envelope. What about the flash drive that was hidden? Here? A sly smile appeared on Rachel's lips. Helen would never hide something so important in the most obvious place. The man we saw took a fake copy. How do you know? Victor asked. Because I placed that copy here myself last week, Rachel replied. Following the instructions Helen left, the real flash drive. Well, you need to find the other half of the story first. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made the three of them quickly move toward the back emergency staircase. The lake house, Victor said as they hurried down. Helen knew only the three of us knew about that place. It was the only spot where we could just be ourselves. No pressure, no expectations, no betrayals, Andrew added softly. We need to go there. Rachel stopped on the 10th floor landing. I'll throw them off. You two use the tunnels to get out of here. Helen left more instructions for me. We'll meet soon. Before they could protest, she had already disappeared through a side door, her footsteps deliberately echoing down the empty hallway, drawing the pursuers' attention away from them. Victor's car sped down Lakeshore Drive, leaving Chicago behind. Andrew watched the landscape through the passenger window, the trees blurring into green streaks against the afternoon sky. Helen's envelope rested on his lap, her words still echoing in their minds. Joseph is following us in the other car, Victor commented, checking the rearview mirror, just as we planned to throw off any pursuers. Do you think it worked? Rachel's plan? Victor nodded slightly. She's always been brilliant at creating distractions. Back in the 90s, when we had tense meetings with investors, she knew exactly how to handle the most delicate situations. How did we not notice? Andrew asked, more to himself than to Victor. Helen and Rachel, working together, all this time building this elaborate plan. Maybe we were too caught up in our own dramas, Victor replied, a hint of bitterness in his voice. Me drowning in my bitterness, me running from the consequences of my actions, Andrew finished softly. But Helen saw beyond. She always saw the bigger picture. Victor's phone rang, breaking the reflective moment. It was Margaret. Mr. Victor. The housekeeper's voice sounded frantic. There are people here at the mansion saying they're from the IRS. They're demanding to see old documents from the construction company. Stay calm, Margaret, Victor replied, exchanging a worried glance with Andrew. Tell them I no longer have anything related to the company. All the documents were handed over during the investigation 30 years ago. After hanging up, Victor gripped the steering wheel tightly. They're getting desperate. It's because they know we're close, Andrew commented. Helen chose this specific moment for a reason. Rachel mentioned that they let their guard down. The consortium, Victor murmured. I read in the papers that they're undergoing a corporate reorganization. Several of the old directors are retiring. Exactly, Andrew agreed, excited. And with the management change, old documents must be moving around, safes being opened, files reorganized. Helen waited for the perfect moment, Victor concluded, when they would be most vulnerable. The road began to wind more as they approached Lake Geneva. Memories started to surface, lazy weekends by the lake, conversations that stretched into the early hours, shared dreams under the stars. Remember the last time we were here? Andrew asked softly. A week before everything fell apart, Victor replied. Helen had prepared a barbecue. She was so excited about the Phoenix project. It wasn't just excitement, Andrew corrected. Now I realize. She was watching us, trying to decide how to protect us. Victor slowed down as they turned onto a dirt road. The lake began to appear through the trees, its waters reflecting the afternoon sun like thousands of diamonds. The property has been abandoned for years, he explained. After the scandal, I never had the courage to come back. The house came into view, an elegant colonial-style building now partially covered in vines. The garden, once meticulously maintained, had turned into a small forest. Joseph stopped the other car a few meters behind them. Victor signaled for him to keep watch at the entrance to the property. "Where do we start?" Andrew asked as they walked toward the house. "The gazebo," Victor replied without hesitation. "It was our favorite spot. Helen always said that's where the best ideas came from." The small wooden gazebo was still standing, miraculously preserved by time. Its white beams, though peeling, kept the structure sturdy. The view of the lake was exactly as they remembered. "There," Andrew pointed to a detail no one else would recognize. A small mark carved into the wood of the railing. 3 intertwined letters, V, A, and H. Victor ran his fingers over the carving, feeling the familiar texture. "Helen did this at our graduation. She said it was to seal our commitment to the future." Andrew knelt down, examining the base of the column where the carving was. After a few moments of investigation, he found what he was looking for, a small cavity skillfully camouflaged in the wood. "She was always detail-oriented," he commented, pulling out a small metal box from the hiding spot. "She knew only the 3 of us knew the story behind this carving." Victor took the box with trembling hands. It was the same model used in the old archives of the Harrington Construction Company, but it had something different, a digital lock system. "We need a password," Andrew stated. Victor looked at the small numeric keypad, 6 digits. "It has to be something meaningful to the 3 of us. The graduation date? Too obvious." Victor furrowed his brow, thinking, Helen loved symbols, hidden meanings. His eyes returned to the carving in the wood, the 3 intertwined letters. Suddenly his face lit up with understanding. "The case number," he murmured. "The first case we won together at the Court of Accounts. Helen always said that was when we truly became a team." Andrew smiled, the memory coming back as clear as crystal. 180675. Victor typed the numbers. The box emitted a soft click, opening. Inside the box was a flash drive, similar to the one supposedly hidden in the office, and another envelope. This one, unlike the first, was sealed with red wax, stamped with the Harrington Construction Company's symbol. "She thought of everything," Andrew murmured, impressed. Victor carefully broke the seal, pulling out a single sheet of paper. Helen's handwriting, so familiar, seemed even more emotional in this letter. "My dearest," he began to read. "If you are reading this, it means you have finally found your way back not only to each other, but also to this place that holds so many precious memories. The gazebo has always been our refuge, our place of truth. That's why I chose to keep the most important part of this entire story here." Andrew sat down on the gazebo bench, his legs suddenly weak. Victor continued reading. "The flash drive you found contains all the original documents that prove the innocence of the Harrington Construction Company. Altered contracts, internal memos from the consortium, recordings of meetings, everything. You need to clear the company's name and expose those who truly orchestrated its downfall." "How did she manage to gather all this?" Andrew asked, impressed. "Rachel," Victor replied, remembering. "She had access to everything, could move through any department without raising suspicions." Continuing to read, "But there is something more important that you need to know. Something I kept to myself all these years, until I was sure it was the right time to reveal it." Victor paused, his hand trembling slightly. Andrew stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder in silent support. "On the day I disappeared, I wasn't running away. I was protecting something far more precious than documents or evidence. I was pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Victor reread the lines several times, his hands now shaking violently. "A girl," the letter continued. "Our daughter, Victor. Forgive me for not telling you sooner, but it was the only way to keep her safe. The consortium wouldn't hesitate to use any means to silence us. Sophia grew up far from all this, protected by the new identity I built for us." Andrew watched his friend with a mix of shock and understanding. "Victor, wait," Victor interrupted him, continuing to read with a choked voice. "She is ready to meet you now. In fact, she already knows you, in a way. Sophia chose to follow in the family's footsteps. She's an architect, graduated with honors from the University of Chicago. For the past 6 months, she has been working at an architecture firm in Chicago under the name Claire Sanders. Victor let the letter fall, stunned. Claire, my new head architect. The young woman I hired 6 months ago. The one who has been reorganizing all the old construction projects, Andrew added, recalling the conversations of the past few days at the mansion. Helen planned every detail, Victor murmured, picking up the letter again. There was more. Sophia doesn't know anything yet. I thought you should be the first to know the truth. As for me, I'm closer than you think. Now that Rachel has done her part, that you two have reunited, and that our daughter is safe, I can finally step out of the shadows. The sound of footsteps on the grass made both men turn. A female figure approached the gazebo, her dark hair dancing in the breeze from the lake. Even after 30 years, she still had the same elegant stride, the same enigmatic smile. Helena, Victor whispered, hardly believing his eyes. She climbed the steps of the gazebo slowly, her eyes glistening with held-back tears. Sorry for the delay, she said softly, but some stories need the right time to be told. Andrew stood up, his voice trembling. You were in Chicago all this time? For the most part, Helen replied, watching from afar, making sure every piece moved at the right moment. Rachel was my eyes and ears all these years. Victor took a step forward, still holding the letter. Claire, our daughter. She's on her way, Helen finished. Rachel went to get her. It's time for all the truths to come out, for all the secrets to be revealed. But first, she approached Victor, gently touching his face. We need to talk about these 30 years of longing. The sun began to set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the gazebo, time seemed to stand still as Helen, Victor, and Andrew reunited after 3 decades of separation. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotions, words left unsaid, and long-awaited explanations. You look exactly the same, Victor finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. Helen smiled, running her hand through her now graying hair. Your eyes are still too kind, Victor. Time has left its marks on all of us. Andrew remained slightly apart, as if afraid to break the magic of the moment. Helen noticed his discomfort and approached him. You deserve explanations too, Andrew, she said gently. In fact, you were crucial to making the whole plan work. How so? He asked, confused. Your apparent escape, your disappearance, all of it created the perfect distraction. While everyone focused on you as the supposed culprit, I could work in the shadows, gathering the real evidence. Victor frowned. So you knew about the threats he faced? Yes, Helen confirmed. In fact, I was the one who suggested he take on the role of the scapegoat. It was the only way to keep him alive and protect his family. The sound of approaching cars interrupted the conversation. Helen smiled, her face lighting up with a different emotion. It's her, she said simply. 2 vehicles stopped near the gazebo. From the first, Rachel emerged with her usual elegant posture. From the second, a young woman stepped out hesitantly, her long dark hair strikingly similar to Helen's in her youth. Claire, or Sophia, paused for a moment, observing the trio in the gazebo. Her eyes, identical to Victor's, were wide with a mix of confusion and recognition. Mom? Her voice trembled slightly. What's going on? Rachel said it was urgent, that there was something I needed to know. Helen descended the steps of the gazebo, reaching out to her daughter. Sweetheart, there's a story we need to tell. You. A story that began long before you were born, but it has always been about you. Claire slowly climbed the steps, her eyes shifting between the 3 adults. Mr. Harrington, I don't understand. Victor, Helen corrected gently. You can call him Victor, or... She paused meaningfully. Dad. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the wind in the trees and the small waves on the lake. Claire swayed slightly, and Andrew instinctively stepped forward to steady her. How? Claire began, her voice faltering. Why? For protection, Helen explained, guiding her daughter to sit on the gazebo bench. The corporate world can be ruthless, darling. When I found out I was pregnant, I also uncovered a conspiracy that threatened to destroy not just the construction company, but everyone I loved. Victor knelt in front of Claire, his eyes brimming with tears. All these months working together, I felt something familiar in you. Your passion for architecture, your attention to detail. The projects you asked me to reorganize, Claire said slowly, the pieces falling into place in her mind. The old construction company files, it wasn't just a restoration job, was it? No, Rachel replied, stepping closer. It was a way to prepare you for this moment, to make you know your family's history through the work they accomplished. Claire stood up abruptly, walking to the gazebo's balustrade. Her eyes scanned the lake, as if searching for answers in the calm waters. All my life, she began, her voice gaining strength. I always felt there was something more, something Mom never told me. The constant moves when I was a child, the way she always double-checked everything, how we could never have old photos at home. Helen approached her daughter, placing an arm around her shoulders. You were too young when I realized they would never stop looking for the evidence. The consortium had eyes everywhere. The only way to protect you was to keep you away from all of it. But now, Andrew interjected, now we have the means to prove everything. The documents your mother kept all these years, the files you helped organize over the past few months, Victor added, are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Claire turned, facing the three adults who had shared such a complex story. Her face showed a mix of emotions, confusion, understanding, sorrow, and surprisingly, determination. The architectural plans I found, she said slowly, had inconsistencies that never made sense to me, structural changes that appeared out of nowhere, unexplained budget shifts. You noticed, Helen smiled proudly. Of course you noticed. You have your father's sharp eye for detail. And now, Claire asked, her steady gaze meeting Victor's, what happens now? Victor took a hesitant step forward. That depends on you. We've already lost 30 years, but if you want, if you're willing, we can try to make up for lost time. And together, we can finally restore the truth about the past. The sun had completely disappeared now, leaving only a soft twilight over the lake. In the gazebo, 5 people shared a moment of reconnection, as the calm waters silently witnessed the beginning of a new chapter in their intertwined lives. Night had fully fallen over the lakeside property, and the group moved inside the house. Rachel, always practical, had brought lanterns and some basic provisions. In the old living room, now illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns, the story continued to unfold. Claire was seated between Victor and Helen on the old couch, absorbing every word as her mother explained the events that led to their escape 3 decades ago. Andrew remained near the unlit fireplace, occasionally adding details to the narrative, while Rachel quietly organized the space. So that's why you encouraged me to study architecture, Claire said, looking at Helen. It wasn't just because I had a talent for drawing. It was your destiny, Helen smiled softly. It's in your blood. But the decision was always yours. I just created the opportunities. How did I get the job at my father's office? Claire still hesitated to use the term. That was Rachel's idea, Helen explained. She had been monitoring the office's activities for years. When she found out Victor was looking for a new head architect, she suggested your resume through mutual contacts. Victor shook his head, amazed. And I never suspected. Even when I saw your exceptional talent for restoration, your intuitive understanding of the company's old projects. You have your father's eye for structures, Andrew commented from his spot near the fireplace, and your mother's creativity for innovative solutions. Claire smiled timidly, still processing all the revelations. The projects you asked me to review, she turned to Victor, they were all from the time of the scandal, weren't they? Yes, he confirmed. Though I didn't know it at the time, you were literally rebuilding your own family's history. Rachel approached the group, carrying a folder she had taken from the car. And your observations about the inconsistencies in the projects were crucial. You found patterns that even we hadn't noticed. How so? Claire asked, intrigued. The changes in the budgets, Rachel explained. You created a spreadsheet showing how certain amounts were systematically altered on specific dates that coincided with the consortium's secret meetings. Helen took her daughter's hand. You have a natural gift for seeing beyond the surface, dear. Just like your father. Victor cleared his throat, emotional. Claire, or do you prefer I call you Sophia? The young woman thought for a moment. Claire is fine. It's who I've always been, but maybe Sophia can be a fresh start for all of us. The group fell silent for a few moments, only the sound of the wind against the windows filling the room. Rachel took the moment to light a few extra candles, creating a cozier atmosphere. What happens now? Claire finally asked. With the evidence, with the truth about the consortium. Now, Helen replied, we can finally present our full story. The documents I kept, combined with your analyses of the projects and the evidence Rachel collected over the years, form an irrefutable case. The timing is perfect, Andrew added. With the current reorganization of the consortium, many of the original players are vulnerable. Some no longer have the power they once did. Victor stood up, walking over to the old bookshelf. But before we take that step, before we bring everything to light, he turned to face the group. We need to be a family again. Claire felt the tears she had held back all night finally escape. I always wanted a father, she admitted softly. I always imagined what he would be like. Victor approached, kneeling in front of her. And I always dreamed of the possibility of having a child, someone to share not just the legacy of the construction company, but all the dreams I haven't yet realized. Helen watched the scene with tearful eyes. Forgive me, Victor. Forgive me for keeping this secret for so long. There's nothing to forgive, he replied without taking his eyes off Claire. You protected us. You gave us the chance to be here today, to have this moment. Rachel discreetly began to leave the room, sensing the family needed a private moment. Andrew followed her, but Claire called them back. Stay, she pleaded. You're part of this story too, part of this family. The group gathered again, now closer. In the center of the room on the coffee table, the flash drive and the documents Helen had guarded for so long awaited the right moment to reveal their secrets. But that night, in that moment, what mattered most were the bonds being restored, the wounds being healed, and a family that, after 30 years, was finally whole again. Morning arrived at the lake house, bringing a new energy. The group had spent the night there sharing stories, filling in the gaps of 3 decades of separation. Now, with the rising sun reflecting on the calm waters, it was time to put the final plan into action. In the old dining room, transformed into a makeshift office, Rachel methodically organized the documents on the mahogany table. Claire, who hadn't been able to sleep, helped categorize the evidence, her architect's eyes finding connections the others might have missed. Look at this, she called out, pointing to a series of architectural blueprints. These modifications to the Phoenix project, they weren't just for overbilling. They were completely altering the purpose of some spaces. Victor approached, adjusting his glasses to examine the documents. Areas that appear as parking in the official blueprints would actually be used for other purposes, Helen added, entering the room with cups of coffee she had prepared in the makeshift kitchen. The consortium planned to use Harrington's reputation to create a network of ventures with questionable purposes. Andrew, who had been on the phone on the balcony, returned with news. I just spoke with my contacts in the real estate market. The consortium is truly vulnerable. The new board is conducting a full audit of the old projects. It's the perfect moment, Rachel commented, sorting through more documents. With the change in management, many of the original players have lost their influence. Some aren't even part of the board anymore. Claire stood up, walking over to the board they had improvised on the wall, where connections between documents and events were traced with colored string, a technique she often used in her architectural projects. If we present everything in the right sequence, she explained, pointing to different spots on the board, the story practically tells itself. Dad's original documents, the forced changes, the veiled threats, Mom's plan. You have a natural gift for visual storytelling, Victor remarked, proud. Just like your mother. Helen smiled, watching father and daughter working together. It was as if the 30 years of separation were beginning to dissolve, giving way to a new reality where her past choices finally made sense. We have one more card up our sleeve, Rachel announced, pulling an envelope from her bag. Last night, while you were talking, I received this from a former consortium employee. Their recent internal emails showing they're still trying to hide past events. Andrew examined the new documents. They're in panic. With the audit closing in on old operations, they're trying to cover their tracks, not knowing the real evidence has been safe all along. And now? Claire asked, her voice a mix of anticipation and apprehension. How do we do this? Victor exchanged glances with Helen before responding. Legitimately, through the proper channels. We'll present everything to the relevant authorities and the new consortium board simultaneously. But first, Helen added, we need to ensure the story reaches the press the right way. Not as a scandal, but as a serious investigation into unethical corporate practices. Rachel smiled discreetly. I've already taken care of that too. I have been in contact with an investigative journalist for years, periodically updating her on the case without revealing crucial details. She is waiting for our signal. Claire observed the group, amazed by the complexity of the plan her mother and Rachel had built over decades. You've thought of everything. No, Helen corrected gently. We couldn't predict how you and your father would naturally connect, how your talent for architecture would perfectly complement our evidence. Some things were simply meant to happen. Victor approached his daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. Which makes me realize we have an important decision to make before moving forward. What? Claire asked, turning to face him. The Harrington Construction Company, he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. After we clear your name, after the truth comes out, it would be an honor to rebuild it by your side. If you want to, of course. Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes. You mean a partnership, Victor finished. Father and daughter, combining experience and innovation, continuing the family legacy, but in an entirely new way. Helen stepped closer to the two. The decision is yours, dear. It always has been. That's why I prepared you, gave you the tools to choose your own path. Claire looked at the painting on the wall, at the documents on the table, at the expectant faces around her. Her entire life had been preparation for this moment, even when she didn't know it. Yes, she finally answered, her voice steady. Yes, I want to rebuild our family's legacy, but not just the Harrington name. I want to rebuild everything we've lost over these 30 years. Rachel cleared her throat discreetly, drawing the group's attention. Then I think it's time. The documents are organized, the evidence is irrefutable. It's time to bring the truth to light. The sun was already high in the sky, its light dancing on the waters of the lake. In the gazebo, where it had all begun the night before, the gentle wind seemed to whisper promises of a future that, finally, could be written as a family. 6 months later, the office on the top floor of the Harrington building pulsed with renewed life. The old walls, once silent witnesses to a painful past, now echoed with the sound of blueprints being unrolled, lively discussions about projects, and the occasional laughter escaping from the president's office. Claire, leaning over her digital drafting table, was making the final adjustments to the project that would mark the official rebirth of the construction company. Beside her, Victor watched proudly as she explained her innovations. If we integrate sustainable technology from the foundation, she pointed out, her eyes shining with enthusiasm, we can create buildings that not only respect the environment, but actively contribute to its preservation. Your grandfather would have loved this, Victor commented, smiling. He always said that a building should do more than occupy space. It should improve the lives of everyone around it. Helen, who had just entered the room carrying a folder of documents, smiled as she saw father and daughter working together. Over the past few months, since the truth about the scandal had come to light, she had watched with joy as family bonds naturally strengthened. The journalist is here for the interview, she announced. Rachel is bringing her up. Claire straightened up, unconsciously adjusting the blazer she was wearing, a gift from Helen identical to the one she herself had worn 30 years ago. Our first official interview as a family, and as partners, Andrew added, entering the room. Since his name had been cleared, he had taken on a consulting role in the new construction company, bringing his experience and industry contacts. Rachel arrived with the journalist, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes who immediately began absorbing every detail of the restored office. After the initial introductions, everyone settled into the conference room. "It's an extraordinary story," the journalist remarked, setting up her recorder. "The revelation of the truth about the scandal, the family reuniting after so long, and now the rebirth of the construction company with a new generation at the helm." "A generation that combines the best of both worlds," Victor replied, looking proudly at Claire. "Tradition and innovation." "And the first project," the journalist continued, consulting her notes, "will be on the very land where the Phoenix project was supposed to be built?" "Yes," Claire answered, her eyes gleaming, "but with a completely different purpose. Where they plan to create a monument to greed, we're going to build a sustainable community center." Helen smiled, remembering how long she had kept the documents. That proved the consortium's true intentions for that land. It's a way to turn a story of unchecked ambition into something that truly benefits the community. "And the partnership with social architecture programs?" the journalist asked. "That was Claire's idea," Victor replied proudly. "We're offering scholarships and internships to talented young architects from underserved communities. It's our way of ensuring that the future of construction is not only innovative but also socially responsible." Rachel, who was observing the scene with her usual discretion, allowed herself a small smile. Her role as the keeper of the family's secrets had ended, but she had chosen to stay now as the administrative director of the new construction company. "And what about the future?" the journalist asked. "What are the plans for Harrington Construction?" Claire exchanged glances with her parents before answering. "We want to set a new standard in American construction, not just in terms of quality and innovation, but in ethics and social responsibility. The name Harrington has always been synonymous with excellence. Now we want it to also be synonymous with positive transformation." After the interview, the family gathered in the old gazebo, which Claire had restored as her first project. The lake was still there, a silent witness to their stories, now reflecting not just the past but also the promises of the future. "You know," Helen remarked, watching the sunset, "when I hid those documents 30 years ago, I never imagined the outcome would be so much more beautiful than just proving the truth." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, sitting between her parents. "The truth clears the construction company's name, yes," Helen explained. "But what really matters is this. Our family reunited, stronger, building something new together." Victor took Helen's hand, while with his other arm he embraced Claire. Andrew and Rachel, inseparable parts of that peculiar family, completed the circle. "And to think," Claire smiled, "it all started with a man fainting at the gate of a mansion." "No," Victor gently corrected. "It started long before, with 3 idealistic young people who dreamed of building something meaningful. And now finally that dream is coming true, in a way even more special than we could have imagined." The sun finally set over the lake, but unlike the past, its absence now brought no shadows, only the promise of a new dawn. In the old house, now restored to be the family's weekend retreat, the lights softly turned on, illuminating the way home. For a family that spent 30 years separated by secrets and circumstances, every moment together was precious. And now, united not just by blood in the past, but by shared dreams for the future, they finally understood that some stories don't need grand conflicts to be extraordinary. Sometimes love, truth, and the courage to start over are all the adventure one needs